This evening, I wanted to talk about a topic that came to my mind. It's called Three Important Steps for the Devotee. And this topic came to mind because recently I was going through some old notes of mine that I had kept from the past, and I I came across an article, or no, not so much the article, but I came across the points. An article that Swamiji had written an article a long time ago that referenced these 3 points. And if any of you have seen this article, and if I could find the original article, I'd like to find it. But I did make note of the points. And it's so, Swami would often, when he was be speaking, he says, now here's 3 things that are extremely important to stay on the path, for the devotee should consider. And it was in that vein that he approached these 3 topics, and he wrote an essay on that. And I'd like to share them with you because I think they are 3 very important points that you might say the progression of our understanding on the spiritual path that we go through. And this is not something that we do all necessarily in one lifetime. This is quite a long progression of spiritual evolution that the soul goes through in their understanding of the spiritual path or in their pathway to God. We have to go at our own pace. Everybody's going at their own pace. And the 3 points that Swami makes, and this first one is I have made in other contexts and in other stories, but it's the first important step, you might say, for the devotee is to decide when we come to that point in our spiritual evolution to live by high principles. In other words, I think if you have tuned into these discourses, I've told a story about the lady in Delhi, probably more than once, of how she had come to a lecture and she was interested enough to come. But when I was talking about some of the deep truths of yoga, Kriya Yoga, and these sorts of things, and reference to God, she came after the program and told me, says, well, I'm not really interested in that. And it was in the question and answer period. She said, I'm just not interested in that. Isn't it enough simply to live by sattvic principles and to be a good citizen, be a good person? And that's what I want to do in this lifetime. And she asked for a comment, and I told her that, madam, what you say, I wish many more people would be just like you. That somebody who's interested in being serviceful, somebody's interested in helping society, helping other people, that's what the world needs at this time, is more people just like you. And then I conclude, I says, but there will come a time when that may not be enough for you and you want something more. And when that time comes, I hope you come back and we can talk further about that. And I meant that very sincerely, because I know over the years that I've been practicing these techniques, I've heard various devotees somewhat disdain, in a disdaining attitude, referring to people they were not ardent devotees and they were perhaps doing social work or good things in the world. And they perhaps made some disdainful reference, well, that's all fine, but, if the real devotee is somebody who, meditates and does sadhanas and all of that, which on the surface is true, but it was, in a sense, it's often said in a tone of voice that is somewhat to diminish another person's serviceful activity in life. And it reminds us that, something I think we should be reminded, that the pathway to God is a long journey. And how many people in this world actually consciously try to live by high principles? A very few. It doesn't even occur to them. It's perhaps, making one's way in life, achieving personal success. I want to be happy, likes the personal likes and dislikes. All of these things are the focus of most people's life. And I think some people who disdain good works because it's all Maya or whatever their attitude might be, I think they do that sometimes simply because they don't do anything. And you might say their thought of being on the spiritual path is not really spiritual at all if you're not including some sense of trying to live by high principles and put those into practice. And so when somebody comes along who's trying to do a good thing, they tend to dismiss it. So I'm sure that's not always the case, but I sometimes get that impression. So I think it's for a devotee, I think we reach a point where we need to refine ourselves, and we realize if we want to make spiritual effort, spiritual progress, we have to clean up our own life, and we have to aspire to something higher than the mere mundane self-seeking and likes and dislikes that much of our lives seems to be engaged in. And so if we come across people like that, I think it's something we should encourage. Think of children coming up. They're not necessarily interested in spiritual values or in a conscious way. They're not interested in seeking God necessarily. But certainly when children express a desire to live by high principles, we give them all the encouragement that we possibly can because we see it. It's a good step. That's the foundation that they build a spiritual life on. And so to encourage people in anything that people are doing good, high values, and make that, you might say, our own foundation, because we have to, the path of Kriya Yoga is built upon positive values of right behavior, acting in the right way. And the devotee is in a constant engagement with purifying one's nature. You might say, refining the chains. Chains of gold still bind, but yet they don't hold quite so tightly as, chains of iron and steel. And so consequently, refine ourselves first, make that effort, but a time will come, as I said to that woman in Delhi, well, the time will come when something more is desired, because we realize that we've done this, we've done that, and we've done it again and again and again. And this longing within every soul, there's got to be something more in life. What is it? And when that question, you might say a little bit of a world weariness for the repetition of rebirth and just seeking high principles does no longer satisfy. When that becomes strong, it inevitably brings us to the second step, which is to recognize that living for God is the highest principle. In other words, naturally we want to serve, we want to do good things. There are high principles, we want to make those. But then there's the reasoning, all of them we come to understand that are subsumed by that one desire that will ultimately satisfy all our desires, and that's finding God. And that highest principle is embodied in that. Now, to recognize that is the first step. To recognize, yes, God is the highest principle. I want to do that. But that's not quite enough. It's not embodied in this second point, just to recognize that. It's to actually make that our spiritual path, or you might say it this way, to actually choose in our own life to live for God as our highest principle. We can't force that on anybody else. We may hold that to be, our supreme value, but the person that hasn't reached that point yet, you can't force that person to do that. But everybody sooner or later will, at their own speed and their own time, come to that point, because it's the natural direction of all of us as we spiritually advance to come to that point. It's a stage we have to go to. Nothing else will satisfy. But we have to choose it, you see. It doesn't come without us making that conscious choice on some level. We're directed that way, but there comes a point that we have to uh, make that the central theme of our life. And this is seek ye first the kingdom of God, and actually doing that in our lives. And it's an interesting thing, though. You do see this when souls come to this stage, sometimes, because they're choosing it, but it hasn't totally interiorized in their reality yet. So outwardly, in order to give that affirmation some power, they become very fervent in their quest for God. And sometimes, of course, if they're of that nature, they end up proselytizing other people. They want also others to rise up to that because they found it. Well, naturally, if you find something good, you want to share it. But sharing and foisting it upon other people are two different things. But nevertheless, I appreciate people's fervency because it tells me that they're at that stage where they're wanting to make it strong. They're wanting to implant it within in themselves, and little by little, as we try to live a noble life and noble principles, this desire begins to come, and we realize. And then not only do we realize, we actually begin to put effort into it. But that's not the third step, which I want to address the next one. And it's this third step, I think you might say, is the hardest in some way to make this jump to this, because the next step is we build on the foundation that we built already with those first two steps, but it's to sincerely open ourselves to spiritual guidance. And we have to open ourselves, not only open ourselves, we have to actually welcome, you might say, spiritual guidance. Just to open yourselves, that it can be somewhat reluctant. Okay, I guess I have to do this, and I'll get guidance. And if you approach guidance in that attitude, you can't really going to imbibe really on a deep level. But to actually welcome and to seek, you could say, as part of that welcoming, to seek guidance, and we begin to seek that guidance from, first, you might say, one of the things is through scripture, moral laws, the traditions of the past, and to be able to try to live by that. Now, it's more than just seeking higher guidance or living by higher principles. It's trying to interiorize that within ourselves, and to say, what am I doing? How can I do this better? I need help, is the theme that underlies that. And when we come to that point in our lives where, yes, we want to live by these higher principles, and yes, God is what I really want, but then realizing that, how do I find God? And I need help. And it's something that I can't provide myself. You could say those first two steps are engagement of the individual will. I am going to take these steps. And then you realize that that's not enough. That just I has to be, you might say, supplanted by higher wisdom. And you could say this is embodied in taking that step of becoming a disciple. Now, becoming a disciple in the inner sense, more so than just affiliating one. We can become a disciple in name and outwardly, but to actually do that inwardly, and that's that opening. That's what's really called for, to be able to really make the progress that we're seeking. And Swamiji called this, he said, this as the most important step on the spiritual path is to make oneself receptive to divine guidance. So you see, it's more than just taking advice. It's being receptive to guidance inwardly, to allow it or you might say, to attune ourselves to that guidance so that we can follow that guidance. And that ends up being might say, the most important step that we can take. And it's going beyond that point that in the normal devotee, Swami would say it's easy to get guidance from a book. And he was, of course, referring to himself in this case. You can self-help books, and we're going to be guided in that because the book can't talk back to you. Real guidance comes if we can have a living guru who can actually guide us. And in the absence of a living guru, wise individuals, perhaps wise disciples of that guru, who can actually guide us, because and a truly wise guide is somebody that doesn't cater to the individual's likes and dislikes. I've often told this story that I came upon this some years ago. Some fellow asked me, he was building a structure at Ananda village, and it was a temple, a building. And he asked me, because I have construction background and I was much more tuned into that sort of background in those days. He asked me to come and inspect it for him and look at it for him. And so I did. I went into the structure and I looked around and I checked everything. And he very sincerely asked me, he says, "What do you think? I'd like your advice." And I said, "Well, a lot of people ask me for advice, but do you want my advice or do you want my support?" And that was the first time it struck me. It was in that physical sense. But in the years since then, I've often noticed people ask me for advice for lots of things, and spiritual counseling and things like that. Somebody wrote me a letter the other day and asked me to edit it. It says, "I really need your advice on this letter." And I said, "Well, they asked for my advice, so I gave it to them." I said, "I didn't like it." And I said, things in that vein. And so this fellow asking me that says, do you want my advice?" I said, "Do you want my advice or do you want my support?" And he thought about it for a moment. He says, "Well, I guess actually I want your support," because he wasn't willing to make the changes that I was about to suggest to him. And I think that's the same thing with people in their life. People look for advice, but what they're really looking for is support. They want to be confirmed in their likes and dislikes. And I think it's something to be mindful of when you ask for advice. Is that really what you're looking for? I think most people want support. And I think, of course, I try to give support as well as advice if advice is being asked. And of course, when you're giving advice, you can only give a little bit at a time, as I've learned that as well, in order for it to be digested. But there comes a point in our lives when we have made God our supreme goal. This is the most important thing. That's the step I really want in life. And then we begin to realize that the step necessary for that to happen is to transcend the ego. And that's really what we're speaking about here when we ask of guidance. Is guidance, how do I transcend this ego? How do I make that process of transcendence a priority? And we recognize that it's important to give up the likes and dislikes in order to be in tune. And this is what Master, of course, says in the Autobiography of a Yogi. He says, "It wasn't until my life is at first, when he had gone to Swami Sri Yukteswar, was guided by whims and fancies. It wasn't until I attuned my little will to his God-given, God-guided will that I attained freedom." And I think that's finding wise souls to attune oneself to, and to be willing to transcend one's likes and dislikes. That is the stage, you could say, is the most important for the devotee. To be open, not on an intellectual level, but to be open in the heart. Because that's first we're open in the heart, and if our heart is open, then eventually the mind will come along, because there's that saying that we say many times, the mind follows the heart. And you can agree intellectually, but if the heart doesn't want to do something, it's not going to do something. So keep these 3 points in mind. And I'm going to stop there with one more short thing. You could, when I read this essay of what Swami wrote and thought about that in my own life, I thought, I could probably add a fourth one to this, and if there was a fourth one step to add, I'd say we come also to the point of living for God is, the most important principle, opening ourselves to guidance being the third principle. And then in order to actualize those in our life, that's the hard part often, to really make them more than intellectual, to make it actually dynamic in our life. And because to keep it from being simply on the mental philosophical plane. So if I was to add a fourth one, I'd say the fourth step would be to serve and share, to be an instrument of those high principles, to be an instrument of this process of ego transcendence, of trying to apply that in our life, to put our actions into manifestation and share with other people. Now, I of course, and others serve as acharyas and serving in that way, but I'm not really meaning it on that level. I'm meaning it on the level that all of us can act in this world, so that we're offering whatever we know in life, whatever we've learned in life, the joy that we feel, the peace that we feel, the satisfaction that we feel. If we felt something, this is what's worked for me, the willingness to include others in that process of upliftment. And I mention this is because, to be an instrument, in other words, I mention this is because this is the natural progress of the soul toward transcending the ego, to unifying ourselves back with God, to being a good disciple, all of these things. If we're doing these things correctly, the measuring stick is joy, to be able to feel joy. Now, I don't mean that we have to feel that all the time to be able to say that we're making spiritual progress. But generally, within our life, there's a certain joyfulness that begins to take over, a sense of being even-minded and cheerful, even-minded and joyful in all circumstances. And if we're not feeling joy or finding joy, I suspect that one reason might be that we're not sharing joy. And we have to, in a sense, we're not manifesting and being an instrument for these principles that I've just shared with you, to put them into action through us. The end result of that is the joyful feeling, these godly feelings. And so consequently, they go together. And I think joy, peace, calmness, these sort of virtues and benefits of the spiritual path are our measuring stick. And if we're truly making spiritual progress, there should be some development in that way, to be able to see that we are changing in that direction. Now, I know somebody's going to think, well, I don't always feel joyful. Well, neither do I, but I try. And I would have to say, stepping back, I am more joyful than I was when I started. I was not a gloomy person, it was certainly by any means, but I think generally I feel a sense that void in my life has been filled, at least somewhat, as satisfactorily, that there's something there, and I feel that sense of joyfulness that underlies. Yes, day to day, there are those things. So you have that sometimes discourage us, but step back. And I see it in the devotees. I see it in the faces of people here that are joining us here and on these Monday night classes. I was in Coimbatore this weekend. I saw people that I had known who had come onto the spiritual path 10, 12 years ago. And I looked at them now and I thought, my goodness, they've really changed. They've really made progress. And I think that applies to all of us. We live too close inside of ourselves often to see it within ourselves, but I think we can get a vague sense of it. And so I pray for that to be the case with you. And so take these in mind, and I'll mention them once more. Deciding to live by high principles. Now, it's not that we leave any of that behind. We have to keep that. Live by high principles. Make a choice to do that. Second, recognizing that living for God is the highest principle, and that implies choosing day by day, moment by moment. I'm going to choose the highest path. And if I do that, things are going to work out right for me. And I'll be able to reap the rewards of that. I mean, it is its own, joy is its own reward, but you'll see your life begins to improve. And then thirdly, on that foundation, opening ourselves to divine guidance. It's not my will, Lord, but thy will be done. And then to the degree, if we want to add number 4, be an instrument. Serve and share those things that you have been able to learn and imbibe in your life with other people. And so I've ended a few minutes earlier than I normally do. And if there's anybody who would like to ask a question, you can put it in the chat box. And if we see something, or I see a chat just popped up there. So anyway, what's the best way to open yourself to others' advice? That's a good question, I guess, but it seems I think you have to clear. I would say, and I'm just right off the top of my head, the answer came to my mind. You have to clear space in your own mental outlook in order to make room for that, because you're in a conversation with somebody, and you speaking, and the other people speaks. And usually, if you look closely, you're waiting for that person to stop so you can put, you're commenting it on, and you're talking in your own mind rather than really listening to imbibing deeply what that other person is saying. And in a sense, our approach to God and our approach to advice is to put our own prejudices and biases and our commentary aside. And not analyzing it in the moment and that's right, that's not right. That mental approach, but be able to let it rest within us and meditate upon that, give it that space and that calm bed, you might say, in which to land within us, so that you can understand whatever that advice is on an intuitive level. And some people are very good at receiving advice. Most people aren't. Honestly, that's what I've noticed. Although I think we all try, as a devotee, we try to be open to advice, but it's not an easy thing. And I have to say this from personal experience, I'm not very good at receiving advice either. It's been because, and you might ask yourself, if you're like me, why? Why am I not good at receiving advice? Because there's a tendency to self-justify, perhaps. Oh, don't really understand my situation, all of those things. But in time, we just back up and we don't hold our own opinions, our own views quite so tightly. I mean, there are certain principles, yes, we have, but even there, we have to be open to interpretation. How do you interpret those principles and put them into practice in daily life? And I think that it comes down to making space to allow advice to enter, allow God to talk to us and to guide us. And I think we really have to want it also, because oftentimes I know advice going back, I don't know if I really wanted the advice. I wanted the advice, but on some level, I had to be willing to really want it in the heart. And then when you really do in the heart, then I think you make that space for it to come in. And how can you be joyful when the surroundings don't approve of that? I don't believe that. Come on. How can the surroundings don't approve of you being joyful? what does the surroundings have to do with you being joyful? You're maybe talking about an expression of joy. In other words, I don't mean joy being laughing and being giddy and telling jokes and things like that. I mean something in the heart. It's a feeling of joy in the heart, and you can do that anywhere, whether whatever the outward surroundings. And secondly, I would object to the reasoning behind that question is you're conditioning yourself by being what other people think and whether they don't think. Joy isn't based upon outward things like that. It's something that naturally bubbles up within you. And so I'm sorry if I'm being a little bit what is the right word, reprimanding on your question, but I think there's a misunderstanding here of what I'm not looking, don't be looking for social approval, but you may be saying, is joy appropriate? Is it appropriate to be joyful when somebody's passed on in a tragic circumstance? Well, to be on a deep level, it's appropriate at any time to feel joy. But your joy is not because that person is passed on. And obviously, your joy isn't expressed outwardly in such a way that it affects that other person, the grieving widow or the child. You empathize with them. And love is to be able to share that empathy. But at the groundswell of underneath of having to, when I say joy, I'm talking about God. To have God's consciousness is the best way to help somebody. If somebody's really grieving, what do you want to do? Do you want to grieve with them, or do you want to help them overcome their grief? Now, how you approach that outwardly, it has to be appropriate, obviously. But if you're from heart to heart, being able to share your love of God, your joy for God, and to touch that other person and help uplift them into that reality, I think that's one of the best things you could do to help that person, to really help that person on that level. And so consequently, that's the level I'm speaking of when I say these things, not on the outward, you might say, expression. You have to express in an appropriate way, but inwardly, you're wanting to share God with other people. And that's the most helpful thing. How to know if the decision I have been making is right, if it does cause unhappiness to some, but causes happiness to me? Well, be careful here now. The best thing is to try to feel happiness for everybody. Is that possible? I mean, that's our goal. I think you're implying that you know that is there's different levels, of course. So let's just say what real happiness is the happiness of God realization and God's contact with us. If that's what I want, and I think that's what everybody wants, and so the outward expressions of that, of course, in this world, people, there's a conflict of how things are expressed, what I want to do in my life. Living by high principles is not accepted by everybody. It may conflict. Well, these are the subtle questions of Dharma, and you might take in mind is when one Dharma conflicts with the lower Dharma conflicts with the higher Dharma, it's no longer considered your Dharma. But you have to be careful when you apply that, because our likes and dislikes can influence us about what our true Dharma is. Isn't that so? I mean, we've all been there, and we have to put aside those the personal likes and dislikes and try to do what's right. If you can do what's right and make others happy as well without compromising your own spiritual principles, well, I would think that's a nice thing to do, helping them. But you certainly don't want to compromise Dharma. But this is the perfect question for life. This is what we find ourselves in this position all the time, having to make those decisions. What's the best for everybody? And so you have to think yourself, other people, what's the best for everybody? Can we find a win-win situation? It's not easy, and that's the struggle of daily life. And we'll make mistakes, but we keep trying, keep trying. Uh, should we follow the heart or the mind if we want to be God's instruments? Ideally, you have to have a balance. We have to follow our heart, we have to follow the mind. In other words, each of them taken on its own to extreme can lead us to into the over the edge, you might say. And as they say, the mind follows the heart. So our mind will follow our heart. So our heart is going to say something, but it doesn't mean it's wise. You see, we want wisdom of the heart, we want wisdom of the intellect and the reasoning capacity as well. We've been, as humans, we've been given the ability to reason, and for purpose, to learn our lessons and to attune ourselves. So you're asking here a difficult question, which should we follow the heart or the mind? I think it depends on your temperament. And I'm going to say this a little bit backwards. Sometimes if you realize that you're a very mental person, it might be wise to give greater consideration to the heart. And if your natural tendency is perhaps a little overly emotional, it might be wise for you to give a little extra attention to the reasoning side of things. I mean, just to counterweight your own proclivities, so that you maybe by that way you'll bring them into balance, and so I think you have to understand where your biases are going to be, and then try to make sure to come into some sort of balance. For myself, I tend to be intellectual a little bit more, so I tend to try to remind myself what's going on in the heart here, not to forget that. And if I had to choose, I would end up going by the heart in myself. But there's always a but, that you have to try to keep them in balance and take one step at a time. Don't go full bore over the cliff, and use your judgment and go one step, try again, one step, test again, and then sometimes you have to turn left, turn right, and keep following your guidance, and testing again and again in that way. Anyway, it's been nice chatting with everybody tonight. Oh, there was one more, and then I'll leave it at that. So during Kriya, are we burning up heart's collection of desires? Well, I would have to ask you, are you? And I don't think necessarily people are. Ideally, we're trying to burn up some of it, but I'll take your question very literally. Are you doing it? Depends how good your kriyas are. And I think I'm being a little joking here, but the fact is that if we do kriyas very well, we do, as the masters say, burn up those kriyas, or neutralize those vrittis. And yes, it's true. But we have to do our kriyas with devotion. We have to do our kriyas with energy, willpower, one-pointed focus, and then and the answer is then yes. But do we do our kriyas in that way? That's the question each of us have to ask ourselves and remind ourselves to do that. Because I was just, I've been jet lagged since I came to India a little bit. Here and there it comes in. And the other morning I was meditating, and I went through my whole mala, and I looked back at the end of that mala and I thought, how deep were those kriyas? I was somewhat semi-conscious and a lot of subconscious, because my mind, I couldn't bring it to a focus because I was just tired, jet lag, how it feels. But yet I did my kriyas anyway. And I think we do it the best we can, but sometimes some are better than other ones. And we have to try our best to do as best as we can to be right there with each of the Kriyas, doing them with focus. And it's better, this is, Swamiji used to say this over and over again, better to do fewer Kriyas with focused attention and quality than 108 Kriyas in a subconscious state. And that was the thought that came to my mind after I finished my 108 Kriyas. But do your best. And I think that's all we can ask, really. And I think that's all God asks of us, Guru asks of us, do our best, try to be regular, and give our, bring the Guru's guidance and help into our practice. So thank you for joining this evening.